The relationship between the United States and Venezuela began with cooperation, trade, and strategic engagement long before it turned into one of the most complicated political rivalries in the Western Hemisphere. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of the most stable democracies in Latin America and one of Washington's most dependable oil partners. American companies operated heavily in the Venezuelan oil industry, and the United States relied on Venezuelan crude to help fuel its growing economy. The partnership remained firm through major global shifts, including the Cold War, when both countries viewed communist influence in Latin America as a threat. This cooperation started to change as Venezuela entered the late 1980s and early 1990s, when economic crises, corruption scandals, and public frustration destabilized the country's political landscape. Rising poverty and inequality created fertile ground for anti-establishment rhetoric. It was during this volatile period that a young army officer named Hugo Chavez attempted a coup in 1992. Although he failed and was imprisoned, he emerged as a popular figure who criticized traditional political elites and accused them of aligning too closely with Washington at the expense of ordinary Venezuelans. When Hugo Chavez won the presidency in 1998, it marked the beginning of a new era. His rise represented a dramatic ideological shift. Chavez promoted a socialist model he called the Bolivarian Revolution, named after independence hero Simón Bolívar. He strengthened ties with Cuba, railed against imperialist influence, and sought to reduce U.S. involvement in Latin America. At first, the United States tried to maintain a working relationship with Chavez. Oil kept flowing, and neither side moved too aggressively. But the atmosphere began to sour as Chavez consolidated power, rewrote the constitution, and took control of state institutions. Oil revenue allowed him to launch major social programs, but these programs came with political loyalty requirements and expanded presidential authority. Tensions escalated significantly in April 2002, when a brief coup removed Chavez from office. The United States was accused by Chavez and his supporters of quietly supporting the coup plotters, though Washington denied direct involvement. Chavez returned to power within 48 hours after public and military pressure. From this point forward, relations deteriorated sharply. Chavez accused Washington of trying to undermine his presidency. The United States criticized Venezuela for democratic backsliding, suppression of the media, and erosion of economic freedoms. Despite this, the oil trade continued, creating a paradox in which two governments publicly clashed but maintained deep economic links. As Chavez strengthened alliances with anti-U.S. governments, especially Cuba, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, he also forged closer ties with Russia, China, and Iran. These partnerships symbolized an ideological challenge. As Venezuela moved deeper into political and economic collapse, the tension between Caracas and Washington shifted from verbal confrontation to a complex mix of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and international maneuvering. By 2017, the economic crisis had become visible in everyday life. People stood for hours in long lines hoping to buy basic goods, supermarkets had empty shelves, hospitals lacked supplies, and salaries lost their value overnight due to hyperinflation. The government continued to insist that the crisis was the result of what it called an economic war orchestrated by the United States, while the opposition blamed years of mismanagement, corruption, and centralized control of the economy. This blame game deepened internal polarization, and the growing instability pushed Washington to adopt a more aggressive foreign policy toward Venezuela. In 2018, Nicolas Maduro held a presidential election that many Venezuelans and a large part of the international community considered fraudulent. Major opposition figures were banned from running, parties were disqualified, and state institutions were fully controlled by the ruling party. When Maduro declared victory, the United States rejected the results. Soon after, Washington recognized Juan Guaidó, the head of Venezuela's National Assembly, as the legitimate interim president. More than 50 countries followed the U.S. position, creating one of the most dramatic diplomatic confrontations in the region in decades. Maduro responded by accusing the United States of sponsoring a coup and deepening the economic crisis by intensifying sanctions. The sanctions targeted not only government officials but also the National Oil Company, PDVSA, which had long been the backbone of Venezuela's economy. These measures cut off the government from its primary source of revenue. The United States hoped that blocking Venezuela's access to oil markets would weaken Maduro's hold on the military and force new elections. Instead, the government turned more aggressively toward Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey to keep the state machinery running. Russian firms took control of parts of Venezuela's oil distribution network, Chinese loans were renegotiated, Iranian technicians helped revive damaged refineries, and Turkey became a channel for gold exports that bypassed U.S. economic restrictions. Inside Venezuela, the political climate grew even more volatile. The government arrested activists, intimidated journalists, and tightened control over the judiciary. Meanwhile, opposition groups attempted mass mobilization. One of the most dramatic moments came in early 2019 when Guaido tried to rally military support and called for a nationwide uprising. Large crowds gathered in Caracas and several cities, hoping for a decisive shift. But the military leadership remained loyal to Maduro, partly out of ideological alignment and partly due to institutional privileges they had gained over the years. When the movement failed to As the negotiations between the United States and Venezuela continued, both sides entered a phase defined by careful calculations, small concessions, and persistent mistrust. The government in Caracas wanted sanctions relief to revive the collapsing economy, while Washington wanted concrete steps toward fair elections and respect for political rights. These goals were deeply interconnected, yet each side viewed the other's demands through a lens of suspicion shaped by years of confrontation. Every meeting, every announcement, and every gesture was analyzed by both governments for strategic intent, making the process slow and fragile. Even the partial agreements that emerged were constantly at risk of unraveling. Inside Venezuela, the political and social environment grew more complicated. While the small economic improvements brought by limited sanctions relief allowed some businesses to reopen and gave the government room to stabilize parts of the economy, ordinary people still faced difficult conditions. Inflation eased slightly but remained high. Electricity and water shortages continued across many regions, and public hospitals struggled to keep basic equipment running. For many Venezuelans, negotiations felt distant from their daily struggles. They wanted realistic solutions, not political speeches or international posturing. Families separated by migration kept waiting for conditions to improve enough to consider returning home, but most saw no clear path for immediate change. The migration wave remained one of the most significant consequences of the crisis. Millions of Venezuelans had already settled in other Latin American countries, and many continued to move toward the United States. This migration became a major factor in U.S. domestic politics, influencing debates about border policy, asylum rules, and humanitarian support. American policymakers often argued that stabilizing Venezuela was essential to reducing regional migration pressure. Caracas, on the other hand, insisted that sanctions were driving Venezuelans to leave and that lifting economic restrictions was necessary to address the root causes. Diplomatically, both countries relied on intermediaries to maintain progress. Mexico and Norway played key roles in facilitating talks. Several Latin American governments encouraged dialogue, hoping to prevent further instability in the region. The European Union monitored developments closely, offering support for potential electoral observation missions. These international partners understood that the crisis had regional implications, affecting economic growth, security, migration flows, and political stability across the hemisphere. Cooperation among multiple actors became essential to preventing a complete breakdown in the process. The Venezuelan government continued to present itself as sovereign and resistant to foreign pressure, but it also recognized the need for some level of engagement with Washington. The ruling leaders.